Hey guys, tonight we begin with a place you think you know. A place of stone and shadows, of crown jewels and quirky ravens. The Tower of London. When you picture it, you probably see Anne Boleyn, chin held high, walking with a tragic cinematic grace to her fate. Or maybe Richard III, brooding in a Gothic chamber, plotting his next move like a Shakespearean supervillain. Pop culture has painted the tower as a sort of grim, five-star hotel for the politically inconvenient, a place of dignified suffering, where historical giants contemplated their downfall in relative comfort before a swift, noble end. Well, let's peel back that romanticized, Hollywood-approved veneer, shall we? Because the reality, for the vast majority of souls who passed through its gates, was anything but dignified. It was a squalid, terrifying, and soul-crushing machine of human misery. It was a place where hope went to die, slowly and often in excruciating, unrecorded detail. It was, to put it plainly, one of the worst places to be a prisoner on God's green, and often very cruel earth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start by bulldozing the central myth, the idea that being a prisoner in the tower was some kind of aristocratic house arrest. Yes, if you were a captured king from Scotland, or a very, very high-ranking nobleman, your initial experience might not have been immediate squalor. You might have been granted a suite of rooms, the right to bring your own furniture, your own servants, even your own cook. But that was the exception. The gilded cage, reserved for a handful of political pawns, whose comfort was a matter of statecraft. For everyone else, it was a nightmare. Think of the tower not as a single building, but as a walled medieval village of despair. A complex of nearly 24 towers, each with its own unique flavor of misery. The White Tower, the Bloody Tower, the Salt Tower, the Beauchamp Tower. They weren't just romantic names. They were containers for human suffering, and the conditions inside were dictated by one simple, brutal factor: money. Your entire existence within those stone walls was a commercial transaction. The constable of the tower, the man in charge, wasn't a civil servant. He was a franchisee of the crown's justice system. He paid the king for the privilege of holding the office, and he made his money back and then some, by extorting every last penny from the prisoners under his care. Everything, and I mean everything, had a price. The food you ate, the clothes you wore, the mattress you slept on, if you were lucky enough to have one. Even the fetters on your ankles were a rental. Don't have the cash? Then you get the cheapest, heaviest, most rust-pitted set that chafes your skin raw. Can you pay a little more? Perhaps we can find you a lighter, more comfortable model for your slow descent into madness. This wasn't a system of justice. It was a predatory business model where the product was your own suffering. The romantic image of a thoughtful prisoner gazing out a window, composing poetry, is a lie. The reality for most was a constant grinding battle against damp, disease, hunger. and the crushing weight of a system designed to break you, body, soul, and bank account. The tower was less a state prison and more a proto-capitalist experiment in monetizing human misery. And you, the prisoner, were not an inmate. You were a customer in the worst hotel imaginable, where the only thing on the room service menu was despair, and the checkout was often a one-way trip to the executioner's block. So, let's talk about checking in. Forget any notion of a quiet, dignified arrival. Your journey to the Tower of London was the first act in a play of ritual humiliation. For most, it began with a boat trip, but this wasn't a scenic cruise down the Thames. You would be brought by barge to the most infamous entrance in all of England, the Traitor's Gate. Picture it. You are in an open barge, shackled. The London of the time isn't the gleaming metropolis of today. It's a chaotic, noisy, and unbelievably smelly place. The banks of the Thames are lined with wooden houses leaning precariously over the water, their sewage chutes emptying directly into the river you're floating on. The air is thick with the stench of human waste, animal dung, coal, smoke, and the general miasma of a pre-sanitation world. And as your barge makes its way downriver, people notice. Crowds gather on London Bridge and along the riverbanks, but they aren't there to wish you well. They are there to mock you, to jeer, to scream insults, and throw whatever refuse they have to hand: rotten vegetables, animal entrails, filth. It was public entertainment, a medieval reality show where your personal nadir was the main event. You weren't just being transported, you were being paraded as a social outcast, a symbol of failed ambition or political disgrace. Your reputation, your family's honor, it was all being shredded before you even reached the prison walls. Then you see it, the tower looming over the river. It's not just big, it's an architectural statement of power. It's designed to intimidate, to crush your spirit before you even set foot inside. And your barge doesn't pull up to some grand landing. It glides towards a low, dark archway set into the base of St. Thomas's Tower. This is Traitor's Gate. The name itself is a branding exercise in dread. As the heavy, water-stained wooden gates creak open, you are pulled from the daylight into a gloomy, dripping Watergate. The sound of the outside world, the jeering crowds, is suddenly muffled, replaced by the echo of lapping water and the grating of the iron portcullis as it slams shut behind you. The air immediately changes. It's cooler, danker, thick with the smell of stagnant water, wet stone, and something else. A faint metallic temps you can't quite place, but your primal brain registers it as old fear. You are hauled out of the boat, your legs unsteady. The guards, the yeoman warders, not the cheerful Peters of modern tourism, but hardened jailers, grab you. They are not gentle. Their grip is like iron, their faces impassive or openly contemptuous. Up a set of slippery stone steps, your chains clanking with a dreadful finality against the stone. You are now inside the machine. The psychological shock is deliberate. You've been publicly shamed, cut off from the world, and delivered into a dark, wet, echoing space that feels like the very bowels of the state. You haven't even been assigned a cell yet. but you've already been stripped of your dignity and your connection to the life you knew. The message is clear. You are no longer a person. You are property of the tower, and things were about to get much, much worse. Once you're inside, your fate, your level of daily misery, is almost entirely dependent on two things: your social status and the depth of your pockets. The tower operated on a brutally clear two-tiered system. It was the historical equivalent of flying first class versus being stuffed in the cargo hold. Except the cargo hold is actively trying to kill you. Let's say you're a big deal. A captured Scottish king, a duke who picked the wrong side in a succession crisis, or even a very high-status cleric. You are, for lack of a better term, a premium prisoner. You might be housed in one of the more luxurious upper-floor apartments in the Bloody Tower or the Beauchamp Tower. Luxurious is, of course, a relative term. We're not talking about a suite at the Savoy. We're talking about a stone room that might have a proper fireplace, a window, albeit a heavily barred one, with a view that isn't just another stone wall, and, crucially, a private latrine. This was the medieval equivalent of an en-suite bathroom, and it cannot be overstated what a luxury this was in a world where most people relieved themselves in a communal pot or a ditch. You would have the right to pay for your own comforts. Your family could send you money, which you would then use to bribe. Pay the lieutenant of the tower for privileges. You could have your own servants to cook and clean for you. You could have your own bedding, your own books, and even a limited selection of wine. Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the tower's most famous long-term residents, basically turned his apartment into a Renaissance man cave. He had a vast library, conducted chemical experiments, and even grew tobacco in a small garden patch. He had his wife and son live with him for a time. But don't let this fool you into thinking it was a holiday. This comfort was a psychological weapon. You are living in a cage, albeit a gilded one. You are surrounded by the constant reminders of your imprisonment. The tramp of guards' feet, the distant clang of a gate, the knowledge that your life is entirely in the hands of the monarch. The comfort itself could be a form of torture, a constant reminder of the life you've lost and might never regain. And this gilded cage was precarious. Your privileges could be revoked in an instant. A change in the political winds, a new, less accommodating constable simply running out of money could see you downgraded from your suite to the squalor of the lower tier with breathtaking speed. The comfort was conditional, a leash to keep you compliant. Now, let's talk about the experience for everyone else. The common prisoners, the political activists, the religious dissenters, the failed rebels, the people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. For you, there is no gilded cage. There is only the pit. You are thrown into one of the lower dungeons. Perhaps a cellar in the Salt Tower, or a lightless hole in the White Tower's basement, grimly known as Little Ease. The name is a masterpiece of grim understatement. It was a cell so small you couldn't stand up or lie down fully. You existed in a permanent, agonizing crouch. Your cell is a void. There is no window. The only light you'll ever see is the flickering torch of a guard when he brings your daily meal. The floor is damp earth or slimy stone, possibly covered with a thin layer of old, rotting straw that is teeming with lice, fleas, and God knows what else. The air is foul, a thick, unmoving cocktail of damp, mold, human waste, and despair. You have no privacy. You might be crammed into a larger dungeon with a dozen other wretched souls, all competing for the same sliver of space, the same crust of bread. Or you could be in solitary confinement, a darkness so profound that your mind begins to eat itself, and the costs, well, you still have to pay. Even here, in the depths of misery, the system is designed to fleece you. You pay for your meager food, ration. You pay for your water. You pay for the straw on the floor. If your family can't or won't pay, you are given the absolute bare minimum required to keep you alive, and sometimes not even that. You are left to rot. The sensory deprivation or sensory overload of filth was a form of torture in itself. Constant cold seeping into your bones from the stone floor. The maddening drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. The scurrying of rats in the darkness, their tiny claws scraping on the stone, sometimes running over your body as you try to sleep. The itching of lice that you can never get rid of. This was the reality for the vast majority of the tower's prisoners. It wasn't a noble confinement. It was a deliberate, systematic process of dehumanization. You were stripped of your identity, your health, and your sanity, one miserable, stinking, freezing day at a time. And the food they gave you was just another turn of the screw. Life in the tower, especially for the common prisoner, was a slow-motion surrender to decay. Your body and your mind were under constant assault, not from active violent torture in the early stages, but from the grinding, relentless attrition of your environment. It was a death by 1,000 miseries, and it often started in your stomach. Let's talk about the food. If you were a wealthy prisoner, you could pay for your own meals. You could have meat, wine, bread that wasn't mostly sawdust. But if you were a ward of the state, reliant on the prison's official rations, you were in for a culinary horror show. The official term for the prisoner's diet was the commons. It sounds almost quaint, doesn't it? Like you're all sharing a hearty meal together. The reality was a monotonous, nutritionally bankrupt, and often disgusting menu. Your daily meal would consist of a small loaf of coarse, hard bread and a gallon of ale. That's it. The bread wasn't your artisanal sourdough. It was often stale, possibly moldy, and made from the cheapest grains available. It was something to fill your stomach, a dense brick of carbohydrates that sat in your gut like a stone. The ale was thin, weak, and probably brewed on site. It was less a beverage and more a way to consume calories and avoid drinking the likely contaminated water. It was the medieval equivalent of a sad, liquid granola bar. On rare occasions, there might be flesh days where you'd get a small portion of boiled beef. The quality was, to put it mildly, questionable. This was the cheapest, toughest cut of meat, boiled for hours in a great vat until it was a gray, stringy mass. It was often off, tainted, or sourced from animals that were already sick. It was less a treat and more a game of gastronomic roulette. This diet was a fast track to malnutrition. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums, loose teeth, and aching joints, was rampant. The lack of basic vitamins would lead to skin diseases, vision problems, and a catastrophic weakening of the immune system. You were being starved slowly, your body cannibalizing itself to stay alive. The constant hunger was a physical pain, a gnawing emptiness that never left you. It made it impossible to think, to hope. It reduced you to a primal state of wanting. Your weakened body was now a perfect petri dish for whatever diseases were, flourishing in the filth of the tower. And flourish they did. The lack of sanitation was apocalyptic by modern standards. There were no proper toilets for common prisoners. You had a bucket in the corner of your cell, which was emptied infrequently, if at all. The stench was unimaginable in communal cells. The waste would just be a part of the foul slurry on the floor. This was a breeding ground for dysentery and cholera, the so-called bloody flux. These diseases would rip through the prison population, causing agonizing stomach cramps, severe dehydration, and often miserable death in your own filth. Then there were the vermin. The straw on the floor was a 5-star hotel for rats, fleas, and lice. Rats could carry numerous diseases, including the plague, the great terror of the medieval and early modern world. A single rat slipping in from a Thames barge could bring the Black Death into the prison. And in those close, unsanitary quarters, it would spread like wildfire. Lice were not just an itchy nuisance. They carried a disease we now know as typhus, but was then called jail fever. Jail fever. It was the great killer of prisoners. The symptoms were horrific: high fever, delirium, a splitting headache, and a painful rash. It was highly contagious and highly lethal. A typhus outbreak in the tower was a death sentence for dozens of inmates at a time. The guards weren't immune either, which is perhaps the only reason they ever bothered to clean anything out. The damp, cold conditions were a perfect recipe for respiratory illnesses. Pneumonia was a constant threat, turning a simple cold into a fatal lung infection. The dampness seeped into your bones, causing rheumatism and arthritis that would leave you in constant aching pain. Your body was breaking down. You were either starving, sick with dysentery, burning with fever, or racked with painful coughs. This physical decay was mirrored by a mental one. The combination of hunger, illness, and isolation was a potent cocktail for psychological collapse. You weren't just imprisoned in a cell. You were imprisoned in a failing body, and the walls of your own mind were beginning to close in. Long before they ever laid a hand on you, the authorities of the tower began the work of dismantling your mind. The physical misery was just the foundation. The real artistry of the tower's cruelty lay in its psychological warfare. For many prisoners, especially those deemed a high risk for conspiracy, the primary tool was isolation. You would be placed in solitary confinement, sometimes for years on end. Imagine it. You are in a small stone room. There is no one to talk to. The only human contact you have is the silent, resentful guard who shoves your meager food through a slot in the door. At first, the silence might be a relief from the chaos of the outside world, but soon it becomes a physical presence, an oppressive weight. You pace your cell until you've worn a groove in the stone. You talk to yourself, at first to stay sane, then because you can't stop. You recite every prayer you know, every song, every story, until they lose all meaning and become just a string of sounds. Your senses, starved of input, begin to play tricks on you. You hear whispers in the silence. You see faces in the shifting shadows cast by a sliver of moonlight. The darkness is no longer empty. It's filled with the phantoms of your own fracturing mind. This wasn't an accidental byproduct of imprisonment. It was a calculated technique. A mind broken by solitude is more likely to confess to anything, just to have another human being to talk to. Guy Fawkes, after the gunpowder plot, subjected to this before his physical interrogation even began. He was left in the dark, alone with his failure and his fear, softening him up for the horrors to come. The goal was to make you desperate for any human interaction, even if that interaction was with your own torturer. And then came the interrogation. This was rarely a simple question and answer session. It was a terrifying, high-stakes verbal chess match where the board was tilted against you and the rules could change at any moment. You would be brought from your cell, blinking in the unaccustomed light, into a chamber where members of the King's Council would be waiting. These were not thuggish brutes. They were some of the most powerful and intelligent men in the country. They were masters of manipulation, intimidation, and logical traps. The questions would come thick and fast. They would twist your words, misrepresent your previous statements, and accuse you of things you couldn't possibly deny without sounding guilty. Why did you meet with this man? Who else was involved in your plot? Did you not say you wished the king well? Why, then, did you act against him? They would use classic good cop, bad cop routines. One counselor might feign sympathy, offering, "You will weigh out if you just cooperate," while another would thunder and threaten you with the direst consequences. They would present you with forged letters, false testimony from your friends, anything to make you feel that your situation was hopeless, and that betrayal was your only option. The entire process was designed to confuse, exhaust, and terrify you. You are malnourished, sleep-deprived, and possibly ill. Your mind isn't sharp, and across the table are men who hold your life in their hands, playing with you like a cat with a half-dead mouse. The sheer mental exhaustion was a form of torture. Many prisoners broke under this pressure alone, confessing to fabricated plots or implicating innocent people just to make it stop. Perhaps the most potent, psychological poison of all was the uncertainty. For most prisoners, there was no trial date, no fixed sentence. You were simply there, right? You existed in a state of suspended animation, with no idea what your fate would be or when it would arrive. Would you be released? Would you be left to rot in your cell for the next 30 years? Or would you, one morning, hear the heavy footsteps of the guards stopping at your door? Not with your breakfast, but with a summons to the scaffold. Every day was a fresh hell of waiting. You would try to read the guards' faces for any clue. You would listen to the sounds of the tower, trying to interpret their meaning. Was that the sound of a scaffold being built? Was the tolling of a bell for someone else's execution? Or was it a prelude to your own? This relentless uncertainty gnawed away at your sanity. It made any kind of mental peace impossible. Hope became a dangerous thing, a flickering candle that only made the darkness seem deeper when it was inevitably snuffed out. Some prisoners, like the Earl of Northumberland in 1585, couldn't bear it and took their own lives rather than endure another day of the Tet unknown. This was the true genius of the Tower's cruelty. It didn't just confine your body. It hijacked your mind. It turned your own thoughts, your own senses, and your own hope into instruments of your own destruction. And for many of its most famous inmates, this psychological torment was just the prelude to a very real and very public end. The stone walls of the Tower are soaked in stories. It was the final destination for a staggering number of historical figures, a who's who of the powerful, the pious, and the pathetic. Their stories, stripped of the romantic gloss, reveal the full spectrum of misery the Tower could inflict. Let's start with perhaps the most famous ghost said to haunt the Tower, Anne Boleyn. Pop culture remembers her as the tragic, beautiful queen, executed on the flimsiest of charges because Henry VIII wanted a new wife. And while that's broadly true, the details of her final days are even grimmer. First, let's debunk a myth. Idea that she had a sixth finger or a grotesque when on her neck was propaganda, spread after her fall to paint her as a monstrous witch who had bewitched the king. In reality, her crime was her failure to produce a male heir, and her sharp, intelligent, and often politically inconvenient personality. When she was arrested and brought to the Tower, she was initially hysterical, then prone to fits of terrified laughter and weeping. She was lodged in the same apartments she had occupied in splendor before her coronation. A cruel psychological twist, if there ever was one. The constable of the Tower, William Kingston, reported her every manic word back to Thomas Cromwell. She was under constant surveillance, her mental breakdown catalogued as evidence. She was forced to watch as her own brother and 4 other men, accused of being her lovers, were taken to their executions. She knew her turn was next. In a final, twisted act of mercy, Henry granted her a private execution within the Tower walls, away from the jeering public mob. He even imported a skilled swordsman from France, as a sword was considered a quicker and more dignified death than the clumsy English axe. But make no mistake, this wasn't kindness. It was damage control, preventing the public spectacle of a queen's execution. On the scaffold, she gave a composed speech, a final performance of queenship before kneeling down. Her end was swift, but it came at the end of weeks of unimaginable mental torture. If an O'Bellon story is a lightning-fast tragedy, Sir Walter Raleigh's is a slow, grinding epic of confinement. The dashing explorer, poet, and courtier of Queen Elizabeth I found himself on the wrong side of her successor. James I, he was imprisoned in the Tower not for weeks, but for 13 years. From 1603 to 1616, this is where we get the image of the comfortable prisoner. Raleigh was a Tier 1 inmate, for sure. He lived in the Bloody Tower, had his family with him for periods, maintained a library of over 500 books, and wrote his history of the world. He even had a still where he devised his great cordial, a medicinal concoction that was basically a sort of 17th century Red Bull, made from dozens of herbs and spices. But imagine the psychological toll. 13 years. A whole chunk of a man's life spent within those walls, watching his son grow up a prisoner. All his energy, his ambition, his desire for exploration, contained within a few stone rooms. He was eventually released on the condition that he led an expedition to find the mythical city of El Dorado without offending the Spanish. The expedition was a disaster. He clashed with the Spanish, and on his return, the old treason charge was reinstated. This time, there was no comfortable retirement. He was swiftly beheaded at Westminster. His long, scholarly imprisonment was just a stay of execution. Perhaps the most chilling story is that of the two young princes, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, in 1483. After the death of their father, King Edward IV, the two boys were placed in the Tower by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, supposedly for their own protection. Ahead of Edward's coronation, they were seen playing in the Tower gardens for a few weeks. Then they were seen less and less. Then not at all. Richard had himself crowned King Richard III, and the boys were never seen alive again. What happened to them is England's greatest historical mystery. The overwhelming consensus is that they were murdered on Richard's orders. Imagine the terror of those two boys, aged just 12 and 9, stripped of their titles, their protectors, and confined to a room. The slow, dawning realization that the man who was supposed to be their guardian was, in fact, their jailer. The fear they must have felt when, likely in the dead of night, assassins crept into their room to smother them. In 1674, nearly 200 years later, workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower found a wooden chest containing the skeletons of two small children. They were believed to be the remains of the lost princes. Their story is the ultimate example of the Tower as a place of absolute power and utter helplessness, where even the most innocent were not safe. These stories, from the Queen to the courtier to the children, all underscore the same truth. The Tower was a place where status, fame, and innocence were no protection. Once you passed through Traitor's Gate, your story was no longer your own. It belonged to the Tower, and the ending was rarely happy. For many prisoners, the daily misery of life inside the Tower was just the long, grim prelude to the final act, execution. And while the axe and the block are the most famous symbols of Tower justice, they were far from the only, or even the worst, ways to die. Let's be clear. Torture was officially illegal in England's common law system. However, the Tower was a legal gray zone. Under the authority of the King's Council, torture could be, and frequently was, authorized by royal warrant. It wasn't used for punishment. It was used for interrogation, to extract confessions, and more importantly, the names of co-conspirators. The most infamous of the Tower's instruments was the rack. You've seen it in movies, but the reality was far more horrific. You would be laid on a wooden frame, your ankles and wrists chained to rollers at either end. The interrogators would pose their questions, with each unsatisfactory answer. A lever was turned, pulling the rollers in opposite directions. The first thing you'd feel is an agonizing stretching of your ligaments and muscles. Then you'd hear the sickening pop and crackle as your joints, shoulders, elbows, hips, knees were dislocated. If they continued, your bones would break. The pain was beyond comprehension, a full-body cataclysm of agony few could withstand. Guy Fawkes, famously defiant, was subjected to the rack. His signature on his confession, taken before torture, is a clear, confident hand. His signature after is a barely legible, spidery scrawl, the work of a man whose body had been shattered. If the rack was too unsubtle, there were other horrors. The scavenger's daughter was a horrifying counterpoint. It was an apron-shaped metal contraption that compressed the body. Your head was forced down to your knees, and your arms were clamped behind you. The device would be tightened, crushing you inwards, forcing blood from your nose and ears, and fracturing your ribs and spine. And then there were the manacles, where you'd be hung by your wrists for hours on end, causing excruciating pain and permanent nerve damage, or simple, brutal beatings. The goal was the same: to inflict such unbearable pain that you would say anything, sign anything, and betray anyone to make it stop if you were condemned. High-status prisoners like Anne Boleyn or Lady Jane Grey might be afforded the privilege of a private execution on Tower Green. This was rare. Only 7 people were ever executed inside the tower walls. The vast majority were taken on a final, humiliating parade from the tower to one of the public execution sites, most famously Tower Hill, just outside the fortress walls. A huge, drunken, jeering crowd would be waiting. Executions were public holidays, a form of grisly entertainment. The executioner was not always a skilled professional. He was often a common criminal who was granted a pardon in exchange for taking the job. This meant they were often clumsy, drunk, or simply bad at their work. An execution by axe required immense strength and precision to sever the head in a single blow. It often took 2, 3, or even more hacks to get the job done, turning the scaffold into a bloody, horrific spectacle of suffering. The execution of the Duke of Monmouth in 1685 was a legendary fiasco, with the executioner, Jack Ketch, taking at least 5 blows and then having to finish the job with a knife. But for those convicted of high treason, a simple beheading was a mercy. The prescribed sentence was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was, without exaggeration, one of the most barbaric forms of execution ever devised by a supposedly civilized state. First, you would be tied to a wooden hurdle, like a fence panel, and dragged by a horse through the filthy streets from the tower to the place of execution. This was the drawing part, and it was designed to inflict pain and humiliation. Then you were hanged, but not to death. You were strung up and cut down while you were still conscious, gasping for air. You would then be laid on a table, still alive, where the executioner would begin the drawing of your entrails. He would cut open your abdomen, pull out your intestines and organs, and burn them on a fire in front of your own eyes. Finally, while you were, by some miracle, still breathing, you would be beheaded. Then your body would be quartered, chopped into 4 pieces. Your head would be stuck on a spike on London Bridge or another prominent location, a silent, rotting warning to all who saw it. This was the fate of William Wallace, of Braveheart fame, and many of the gunpowder plotters. This was the ultimate expression of the state's power, not just to kill you, but to obliterate you, to desecrate your body and turn it into a tool of terror. It was the final, gruesome endpoint of a journey that began at Traitor's Gate, wound its way through the psychological hell of the cells and interrogation rooms, and ended in an explosion of unimaginable public violence. So yes, it sucked to be a prisoner in the Tower of London. It was a place designed to break you, fleece you, and if necessary, erase you in the most horrific way imaginable. A far cry from the noble prison of our imagination. So yes, the life of a prisoner in the tower was brutal, short, and anything but glorious. A terrifying example of how a state can use architecture and bureaucracy to crush the human spirit. But power and brutality weren't always confined to the cold stone of a fortress. Sometimes they sat on the throne itself, draped in silk and jewels, as was the case with a woman who rose from the very bottom of society to become one of the most powerful and ruthless rulers in the history of the Byzantine Empire, the Empress Theodora. Forget everything you think you know about empresses. Forget the porcelain dolls raised in palaces, trained from birth in etiquette and diplomacy. Before Theodora was Empress of the Byzantine Roman Empire, consort to the mighty Justinian, she was something else entirely, something the high and mighty of Constantinople would never let her forget. Our story begins not in a palace, but in the grime and chaos of the Hippodrome, the colossal chariot racing stadium that was the heart of Constantinople. It was the city's entertainment hub, its social pressure cooker, and its political powder keg. And Theodora's father, Acacius, was a bearkeeper for the Green Chariot faction. His job was, essentially, managing the animal acts that entertained the crowds between races. It was a low-status, smelly, and thankless job. When her father died, suddenly, Theodora, her mother, and her two sisters were left destitute. In a desperate plea, her mother, now remarried, presented her 3 young daughters to the crowd at the Hippodrome, wearing garlands, begging for her new husband to be given her old husband's job. The Greens, her father's old employers, callously refused, but their rivals, the Blues, in a moment of political gamesmanship, gave the family a similar post. This single act of pity, or perhaps strategic spite, would have massive consequences. Theodora never, ever forgot who had helped her, family, and who had snubbed them. She would carry that grudge for the rest of her life. But a bearkeeper's salary couldn't support a family. So, as soon as she was old enough, Theodora entered the family business. And in the world of the Hippodrome, for a poor, beautiful young woman, that meant one thing: the stage. She started as an actress. But actress in 6th century Constantinople was a catch-all term that was completely synonymous with prostitute. The two professions were indistinguishable. And Theodora wasn't just any actress. According to the historian Procopius, our main, and admittedly very hostile, source, she was a sensation. She wasn't a classical tragedian. She specialized in a kind of burlesque or striptease comedy. Her most famous act, which Procopius describes with pearl-clutching horror, involved geese. She would lie on her back on stage, and servants would scatter barley over her. And trained geese would then come and pick the grains off her naked body. This was not a respectable profession. It was the absolute bottom rung of the social ladder. Actresses were legally barred from marrying senators or high-ranking officials. They were seen as public property, sexually available to anyone who could pay. Theodora's life was one of exploitation, of using her body and her wit to survive in a brutal, male-dominated world. She was, by the standards of her time, a degenerate, a woman of the gutter. But she was also sharp, intelligent, and charismatic. And it was this combination of street smarts and scandalous beauty that would catch the eye of the single most powerful man in the empire. A man who should have been utterly unattainable. The heir to the imperial throne, Justinian. The meeting of Justinian and Theodora is the stuff of legend. He was the nephew and heir of the reigning emperor, Justin. He was a serious, devout, and ambitious man, raised in the corridors of power. She was the star of Constantinople's seedy underbelly. It was a collision of two worlds. Justinian was utterly captivated. It's easy to see why. The women of the court were raised to be demure, pious, and predictable. Theodora was none of those things. She was witty, fearless, and had a raw, unfiltered understanding of human nature that could only be learned by surviving on its lowest rungs. She knew how the city worked, how the common people thought, what they feared, and what they loved. For Justinian, a man surrounded by sycophants and political schemers, she must have been a breath of fresh, if scandal-scented, air. He fell deeply in love. But there was a problem, a huge one. The law, specifically an old Roman law, reinforced by Christian morality that forbade a man of senatorial rank, let alone the heir to the throne, from marrying an actress. It was unthinkable. Social suicide. Justinian, however, was not a man to be deterred. He was obsessed. He first set Theodora up as his mistress, showering her with wealth and property. But he wanted more. He wanted her as his wife, his partner, his empress. To achieve this, he had to move heaven and earth. He pressured his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change the law. The old empress, Euphemia, was horrified by the idea and blocked the marriage until her death. But once she was gone, Justin finally relented. He passed a new law, specifically allowing retired actresses to marry into the elite if they had reformed their ways. The entire legal framework of the empire was rewritten for one woman. In 525 AD, the gutter performer and the heir to the throne were married in the great church of Hagia Sophia. When Emperor Justin died 2 years later, they were crowned together as equals. Justinian and Theodora, co-rulers of the Byzantine Roman Empire. Imagine the shock. The gossip in the marble halls of the great palace must have been weapons grade. The senators and their high-born wives, who had once perhaps hired Theodora for their private parties, now had to bow to her. They had to call her Augusta Empress. Her journey from the filth of the hippodrome to the holiest sanctuary of the imperial palace was complete. But clinging to power would prove to be even harder than acquiring it. And Theodora would prove to be even more ruthless than anyone could have imagined. For 5 years, Theodora and Justinian ruled together, embarking on ambitious, legal, and architectural projects. Justinian was the grand visionary, the tireless administrator. Theodora was his closest advisor, his political partner, his eyes and ears in the city. But in 532 AD, their reign and their lives came terrifyingly close to a fiery end. Started where Theodora's own story began, the Hippodrome. Tensions in Constantinople were always high between the two main chariot factions, the Blues and the Greens. They were more than just sports teams. They were a bizarre mix of street gangs, political parties, and religious sects. Justinian and Theodora were patrons of the Blues, the faction that had once shown her family a sliver of kindness. Following the arrest and execution of some members of both factions for murder, the Blues and the Greens did something unprecedented. They united. They exploded in a furious citywide riot. Their chant was Nika, meaning conquer or win. The Nika riot had begun. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. The mob, thousands strong, surged through the streets, destroying landmarks, including the original Hagia Sophia Church. They were no longer just protesting the arrests. They were protesting high taxes, Justinian's perceived arrogance, and the scandalous presence of Theodora on the throne. They cornered Justinian in the Great Palace and, in a stunning move, crowned a new emperor, a reluctant nobleman named Hypatius. Justinian panicked. His generals were telling him it was over. His advisors were telling him to flee. The boats were literally waiting at the palace's private harbor, ready to whisk the imperial couple away to safety, to exile. Justinian was ready to go. The dream was over. And then Theodora spoke in the panicked council of men who were ready to run. She stood up and delivered one of the most badass speeches in history. Procopius, who despised her, was still so impressed, he recorded it for posterity. She told the assembled men that this was no time for a woman to be giving advice on courage, but that the situation was desperate. She said that while flight might be an option, she would not go. She argued that everyone who is born must die. But for a ruler to become a fugitive was an unbearable disgrace. And then she delivered the immortal line, "I will not be separated from this purple." The imperial purple was the color of the emperor. She was saying she would rather die a ruler than live as an exile. She concluded, "As for me, I approve a certain ancient saying that royalty is a good burial shroud." Or, as it's more famously paraphrased, "Purple makes a fine shroud." Her speech electrified the room. It shamed the men and stiffened Justinian's spine. Shaken out of his panic, he turned to his loyal generals, Belisarius and Mondus. They concocted a desperate, brutal plan. Belisarius took a contingent of loyal troops and entered the Hippodrome through one entrance, while Mundus entered through another. The rioters were all packed inside, celebrating their victory and acclaiming their new emperor. Belisarius and Mundus sealed the exits and gave the order. What followed was a massacre. The soldiers, cold-blooded professionals, simply slaughtered everyone inside. Men, women, children, blues, greens. It didn't matter. They butchered them all. By the end of the day, an estimated 30,000 people lay dead in the Hippodrome. The Nika riot was over. Justinian and Theodora were safe. Their throne was secure, washed in a river of blood, and no one was left in any doubt about the nature of the a woman who sat beside the emperor. The former actress had faced down the entire city and had not blinked. She had been willing to die in her palace, and in doing so had shown she was more royal than any of them. But her ruthlessness was not just reserved for moments of crisis. It would become a hallmark of her reign. With the Nika riot crushed, Theodora's power was absolute. She was not just a consort. She was a true co-ruler, a Basilissa. Her name appeared alongside Justinian's on state decrees. Foreign ambassadors had to pay homage to them both. She pursued her own policies, often with a ruthlessness that shocked even the hardened Byzantine court. She never forgot a slight. The senators and patricians who had backed the riot and supported the usurper, Hypatius, were dealt with mercilessly. Hypatius and another noble were executed, their bodies thrown into the sea. Their supporters were exiled, their wealth confiscated. Theodora personally oversaw the downfall of her enemies. She had a network of spies and informants that reached into every corner of the palace and the city. To cross her was political and often literal suicide. One of her greatest rivals was the powerful and talented general Belisarius. While he had saved her throne, his wife, Antonina, was one of Theodora's ladies-in-waiting and closest confidants. Through Antonina, Theodora kept a very close watch on the popular general, ensuring he never became powerful enough to be a threat. She played the long game of power politics with a skill born of a lifetime of survival. She also took a keen interest in religious doctrine, which in the Byzantine Empire was the same thing as national politics. Theodora was a staunch supporter of the Miaphysites, a Christian sect that had been declared heretical by the mainstream Chalcedonian Church, to which Justinian belonged. This theological difference should have caused a rift between them, but they handled it with a strange political genius. Justinian would publicly condemn the Miaphysites and issue edicts against them, pleasing the official church. Meanwhile, Theodora would secretly offer them protection, hiding their bishops in her private quarters in the palace, funding their monasteries, and using her influence to soften the blows of her husband's laws. It was a bizarre double act. Were they truly at odds? Or was it a calculated policy to keep both sides of a religiously divided empire loyal to the throne? With Theodora, it's hard to say. What is certain is that she championed the underdog, the persecuted sects, just as she had once been an underdog herself. But she wasn't just an iron-fisted political operator. She was also a pioneering social reformer, especially on behalf of women. Drawing on her own horrific experiences, she enacted a raft of laws that were centuries ahead of their time. She made rape a capital offense, punishable by death. She expanded the property rights of women. She altered the divorce laws to be more favorable to them. And most remarkably, she took on the sex trade. She outlawed forced prostitution and established a convent, the Metanoia Repentance, as a safe house for former prostitutes. It was essentially the world's first state-sponsored women's shelter. She bought girls out of brothels canceled their pimps' debts, and gave them a place to live in safety and dignity. The bearkeeper's daughter, the girl from the gutter, never forgot where she came from. She used her absolute power to protect women who were trapped in the same life. She had so narrowly escaped. Theodora was a walking contradiction. She was a saint to the downtrodden and a terrifying demon to her political enemies. She was a champion of the Christian faith and a woman whose past was a litany of what the church considered mortal sins. She was an empress of terror and an empress of charity. She was, in short, one of the most complex, formidable, and fascinating women ever to hold power. She died in 548 AD, likely from cancer, leaving a grief-stricken Justinian to rule alone for another 17 years. But the shadow of the bearkeeper's daughter, who became an empress, would loom over the empire for the rest of his reign, a testament to her iron will and her incredible, scandalous journey. There are few things the British Empire in the mid-19th century did better than supreme, unshakable confidence. It was the age of Victoria, the height of industrial power and colonial reach. The British looked at a map of the world not as a collection of foreign lands, but as a to-do list. And one of the biggest items left on that list was the Northwest Passage. For centuries, the idea of a navigable sea route through the Arctic, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific, was the holy grail of exploration. It promised a shortcut to the riches of Asia, a way to bypass the long, dangerous voyage around South America. Dozens of expeditions had tried and failed, beaten back by the impenetrable ice and unimaginable cold. But by 1845, the British Admiralty felt they had cracked it. This time, they would not be denied. They decided to mount the most technologically advanced, best equipped, and most experienced expedition in history. This wasn't going to be a desperate gamble. It was going to be a scientific conquest, a demonstration of British ingenuity and dominance over the natural world. At the heart of the expedition were two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. And let's be clear, these were not just any old wooden ships. They were bomb vessels, built with massively reinforced hulls, designed to withstand the recoil of giant mortar. They were essentially the battleships of their day, tough as nails. For this journey, they were refitted to be state-of-the-art polar exploration machines. They were equipped with steam engines, a brand new technology taken from railway locomotives. These engines could power a propeller, allowing the ships to push through patches of ice without relying on the fickle Arctic winds. Their bows were reinforced with thick iron plates, turning them into primitive icebreakers. They had a steam-powered heating system to keep the crew's quarters comfortable, and they were packed to the gills with provisions. We're talking about a 3-year supply of everything. Over 136,000 pounds of flour, 30,000 pounds of salt beef and pork, and most famously, over 8,000 tins of canned goods, soups, vegetables, and preserved meats. This was another cutting-edge technology, a supposed guarantee against the old sailor scourge of scurvy. The ships were floating grocery stores, libraries, and science labs. They had everything they needed, and to command this magnificent enterprise, they chose Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, a man who had fought at the Battle of Trafalgar. He was a national hero. He was also, arguably, the wrong man for the job. He was a bit old, a bit overweight. His previous Arctic command had ended in a disastrous overland trek known as the Journey, where Franklin ate his boots. But he had political connections, and his public reputation was sterling. He was seen as a safe, steady hand. In May of 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, with 129 officers and men, sailed from Greenhithe, England. They were the pride of the nation. Flags were waving, crowds were cheering. The newspapers declared the Northwest Passage all but conquered. As they sailed west, they were a perfect symbol of Victorian confidence, powerful, technologically superior, and utterly convinced of their own invincibility. It was the last time any of them would be seen alive by European eyes. The first 2 years of the expedition were, as far as we can tell, relatively successful. A note later found in a stone cairn tells the official story. Franklin and his crew spent the winter of 1845 to 46 frozen into the ice near Beechey Island, a common practice for Arctic expeditions. They built an encampment, conducted scientific readings, and seemed to be in good spirits. 3 men died that first winter from what was likely tuberculosis, and were buried in elaborate graves on the island. Their headstones, a lonely testament to the expedition's presence. The following summer, in 1846, the ice melted, and the ships pushed south into the unknown labyrinth of islands and channels. They were sailing into the blank spaces on the map. And then, somewhere off the coast of King William Island, the ice closed in again. And this time, it did not let go. The ships were trapped, frozen solid in a vast moving pack of sea ice. The second winter, 1846 to 47, must have been harder. The novelty was gone, replaced by a growing sense of frustration and anxiety. And then, in June of 1847, disaster struck. The note found in the cairn records it with stark military brevity. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. We don't know how. A heart attack? A stroke? An accident? The records are silent. The great leader of the expedition was gone. The command fell to Captain Francis Crozier, the Irish commander of the Terror. Crozier was a far more experienced and pragmatic Arctic sailor than Franklin, but he had inherited a hopeless situation. The ships remained trapped throughout the summer of 1847. Another long, dark winter loomed, their third in the ice. Morale must have been plummeting. The men were staring out at an endless, monotonous landscape of white. The steam engines were useless. The reinforced hulls were groaning under the immense pressure of the ice. The state-of-the-art technology had failed them, and something else was going wrong. Something insidious. The men were getting sick. They were growing weak. Their gums were bleeding, their minds becoming clouded and paranoid. The 8,000 tins of food, their guarantee of health, were poisoning them. The canning process was new, and the contractors who supplied the expedition had done a rushed, shoddy job. The lead solder they used to seal the cans was thick and carelessly applied, oozing into the food inside. With every meal, The men of the Franklin expedition were getting a dose of lead. It was a slow, creeping poison. Lead poisoning causes agonizing stomach pain, weakness, and severe neurological damage, including confusion, irritability, and madness. They were losing their bodies and their minds, trapped in a frozen hell by the spring of 1848. After 19 months stuck in the ice, Crozier made a desperate decision. The ships were never getting out. Their only hope was to abandon them and march overland. On April 22, 1848, the 105 surviving men of the expedition stepped off the Erebus and Terror and onto the ice. Their goal was to walk hundreds of miles south to a Hudson's Bay Company outpost on the Canadian mainland. It was a journey into oblivion. The sight must have been surreal. 105 British sailors, dragging heavy lifeboats mounted on sledges, stumbling across the jagged, unforgiving sea ice. They were hauling a bizarre collection of items: silverware, books, silk handkerchiefs, button polishers, the little comforts and symbols of a civilization they refused to let go of, even as they were starving and dying. The march was a catastrophe from the start. The men were already weakened by scurvy and lead poisoning. The terrain was brutal. The weather was relentless. They began to die along the way. First a few, then more and more. They would stumble, fall into the snow, and not get up. Their comrades, too weak to help, would simply have to leave them behind. This is where the official record ends, and the oral history of the local Inuit people begins. For years, the Inuit told stories of meeting these strange, desperate white men. They described a long line of men hauling a boat, their faces blackened by frostbite and soot, their eyes wild. They were thin and clearly starving. The Inuit tried to help, offering them seal meat, but the sailors, still clinging to a sense of superiority, were perhaps too paranoid and confused from the lead poisoning, sometimes refused to help or were unable to communicate. The march turned into a death trail. The route south along the coast of King William Island became littered with skeletons and discarded equipment. One by one, the proud conquerors of the Arctic were picked off by starvation, hypothermia, and disease. And then came the final, most horrific chapter. The Inuit told stories of finding camps with clear, unmistakable evidence of the ultimate taboo: cannibalism. They found skeletons that had been dismembered, skulls that had been cracked open to get at the brain, and bones with telltale cut marks from knives, showing that the flesh had been systematically stripped off. In one location, they found a pile of human bones, many of them broken and boiled inside one of the expedition's cooking pots. For years, these stories were dismissed back in Britain. The idea that brave British sailors, the heroes of the Royal Navy, could resort to such a savage act was unthinkable. It was an insult to the memory of the dead and to the honor of the Empire. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's formidable widow, spent years and a fortune trying to suppress these stories and find evidence of a more heroic end for her husband's men. But modern archaeology and forensic science have proven the Inuit right. Analysis of the bones found along the trail of the dead confirms it all. The cut marks, the breakage patterns, the signs of defleshing. It's all there. The Franklin expedition the pinnacle of Victorian pride and technology, had ended in a desperate, starving, lead-poisoned nightmare of madness and cannibalism. They hadn't conquered the Arctic. The Arctic had consumed them for over 150 years. The fate of the Franklin expedition remained one of the world's greatest maritime mysteries. Dozens of search parties were sent out in the 19th century, finding only the graves on Beechey Island, the note in the cairn, and the grim trail of skeletons and relics on King William Island. The ships themselves, Erebus and Terror, had vanished, but the stories of the Inuit held the key. They had always said that one ship sank in the ice, while another drifted south before it went down. But their knowledge was largely ignored by the official searchers. Then, in the 21st century, a new search began, this time combining modern technology with a deep respect for that traditional Inuit knowledge. Canadian archaeologists worked closely with Inuit historians, listening to their stories, mapping the locations they described. And in 2014, the breakthrough came. A team found the wreck of HMS Erebus, lying in shallow water, almost exactly where an Inuit man had said he saw it generations ago. It was a stunning vindication of the oral history that had been dismissed for so long. 2 years later, in 2016, came the second miracle. Following another tip from an Inuit source, the search team found the wreck of HMS Terror. It was in astoundingly good condition, resting peacefully on the seabed. Its masts broken, but its hull largely intact. It was found in a place called Terror Bay. Sometimes, history has a grim sense of poetry. The discovery of the ships has opened a new window into the disaster. Divers can now explore the cabins, finding plates still stacked on shelves, scientific instruments in their cases, and books preserved in the silt. It's a ghost ship, a perfectly preserved tomb from the mid-19th century. The story of the Franklin expedition is a chilling parable. It's a story about hubris, about the belief that technology and arrogance can conquer the raw power of nature. The mighty British Empire sent its best and brightest, armed with every advantage they could conceive of, into the Arctic. And the Arctic, with its silent, indifferent power, broke them. It froze them, it starved them, it poisoned them, and it drove them mad. The men who sailed on the Erebus and Terror set out to write their names into the pages of history, and they succeeded, but not as conquerors. They succeeded as a dark and enduring warning, a ghost story of ice and ambition, whispered on the frigid winds of the Northwest Passage. All right, guys, that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. From the cold stones of the tower to the even colder ice of the Arctic. A reminder that the past is often a much grimmer and more complicated place than the stories. We like to tell ourselves, thank you for joining me on this journey. It's always a pleasure to have you here, sharing these late-night explorations. Sleep well, and I hope to see you all again next time.